Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Cosmin, for the introduction and invitation, and to Freya as well for the invitation and conversation previous to this day of the conference. Can we begin with the first slide, and then I can click on my own, please? Great. Thank you very much. So in 2008, actually in 2007, after having worked for a long time, I got a grant from the Foundation for Arts Initiative. It was a travel grant, and it was only $7,000, but for me it was a huge amount of money. And I decided to take my own sabbatical. I decided then in 2008 to quit my position at Art in General, where I had been working for quite a long time, and I would say that I worked about 22 hours every day for many years, and I decided to come to China. 2008 was a year that many things were going on here. We've already heard about this for the last 2 days, but also it was the opening of the Ulen Center for Contemporary Art that I actually had planned to come to, and to be able to spend a month here investigating the art scene. I, as many people that were working independently, not to say not being hired at that time, and I was not applying, I decided to pitch a number of stories so that I could make a couple $100s here and there along the way of that trip. That and many other trips, which was that entire year of 2008. So for 2008, I pitched a magazine called Art Info to actually review the art fair that happened to coincide during my trip there. And they said, go ahead, please come and review. There's not one, but there's 2 art fairs going on in Beijing. Please review it for us. The art fair was not exactly, as you could see, the purpose of my trip. And the editor, I believe his name was Daniel at that time. I never met him in person, just via email. The editor emailed me back to say he was very disappointed with the piece, that they were going to publish it because they had actually assigned it, but that he was not expecting a piece like that. He wanted prices. He wanted names of people who were buying. He basically wanted to know a bit more pretty much about the market. My article focused on the kinds of art, the kinds of pictures that artists were presenting. It's online, and actually just found it. I didn't even know that it was still active. Obviously, during that time, I was much more interested in writing and investigating other things. The emerging art scene in China was something that would be new to me. I had been then working pretty much in nonprofits in New York that had focused, or at least that my role was focused in identifying emerging artists and helping them develop work that was too challenging for them to do alone. So during this time, I developed a blog that's still online, that still exists, but at that time was very, very active. And I decided that during my time here, I would publish a series of interviews with foreigners that were working as curators in China. That had many reasons, because during my trip, I pretty much fell completely in love with China, and you'll see also why with Hong Kong. I wanted to come here, and more on that soon. The China trip was also an occasion for me in this so-called sabbatical year that I had decided to take to be able to sort of address a kind of midlife crisis, meaning do nothing, just think, and actually reflect on or investigate during my time here my own roots, my Chinese roots that were not very much developed or explained at home. This is actually the entrance to my town in Mexicali, Mexico. It is the border town of Mexico and the United States. The cities are called Mexicali and Tijuana. And the border wall that divides the 2 countries is there, as you could see in the background. And the cars that are queuing to the left are the cars that are crossing to the United States. And the cars here, basically, that would be coming to this side, to the right side, would be the ones coming into Mexico. So my hometown, as small as it is in the entire country, and as symbolic as it could be that it's actually the entrance into Mexico, has a Chinese pagoda as its entrance, particularly because I am one of many, many families that actually are from a Chinese descent, and then pretty much built this town since the 1919s in the country. Enough of talking about Mexicali, my hometown. When I came to China, I actually met two of my classmates from school that I had met in the 90s and that are from here. And in fact, David Chan is here. To my surprise, I just saw. He's the one pictured here to the right. And I'm going to be showing just a group of about 6 slides of a slideshow that I made in Picasa to my parents and my siblings, my cousins, and my sort of larger family to describe to them how I found as being the first in the family, how I traced back and found the home of our grandfather. So Wei Chun Chao and David Chan, I had met in Shanghai, and I had told them already about the trip. I had a note paper that was scribbled in Mandarin that I didn't understand. I said, this is where I'm gonna go, do you know where it is? And I said, I only know it's in the south of China. David Chan, all these, it's in Spanish because it was for my family, and I decided last minute to introduce it here. So you don't know how to read, so I'm just going to tell you very quickly basically what it says. So this is like the 10th slide in the slideshow. So I tell them that when I met Wei Jun and David to actually catch up what had happened after school, where they were working, that when I told them the story, David offered to help. So David basically, I said, I'm going to go to Guangzhou and then from there figure out where to go, what to do. And David connected me with an artist called Chong, who not only has a foundation and is an artist. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. I wasn't. But basically, he has a foundation that, oh and behold, is called Librería Borges. It's a bookstore, and they actually translate. And in fact, it was in Spanish, the entire typography and brand of the translation company. I thought that was a sign. I thought that if Borges will take me, if the chauffeur of Shangtong was going to take me in a car called Borges to go search for my grandfather, what could be best? I had engaged not curators, but in this case a friend called Chong, who's based in Singapore, and I asked him to join me on this trip and to help me to serve as an interpreter. He said, I don't know Cantonese, but maybe my Mandarin does. And so here we are in a town called Dongshengli, which is where my grandfather is from. And this is very, very, very distant relatives, meaning he's the cousin on the left. He's the cousin of the mother, he's the son of the cousin of, it's a complicated thing, but the whole point is that they live in a town nearby. This is west of Guangzhou, west of Kaiping. And if you know south of China, you may also know that most of the immigrant communities of Chinese, meaning most of the families that leave China to go abroad, actually come from this area. And in very similar cases as it is, for example, in countries like in Central America, there is an architecture that is actually specifically done with the money, with the funds that come from the United States back into the countries where the immigrant community comes from. Dongshengli is a small village, pretty much it's abandoned, and these very, very, very distant family members were the ones that pointed me out to what is the home, or what was the home of my grandfather. A very, very, very small, not only destroyed area. The town must have, at one point, must have had like 60 families living there. Right now, there's about 3 people. It's completely abandoned. Basically, after that trip, I came back to, I didn't come back, I actually made my trip to Hong Kong. And this was part of that same investigation. My grandfather had had a family, had had children in China before moving there. And when he had left, he helped them to move here to Hong Kong, which is where they lived and which is where I came. I was very moved in Hong Kong, and this is not the last slide. As I said, it was a very large slideshow. That was the way in which I could share to my family, not only from abroad, just because I simply do not live in Mexico and haven't been living there in a long time, how you could share with that. But it was 2008, and my life changed. That trip to the south of China was very important. And when I arrived here in Hong Kong, I met with Tobias, who's here, and he will be presenting tonight. And he was leaving Parasite, and they encouraged me to apply, and I did apply for the position of director. And And not only that, I was very kindly offered the position in 2008. And at that time, my partner, who is no longer my partner, asked me not to go to Hong Kong. So with much sadness, I turned that invitation down, and I haven't been back here since then. But this is a place that is very close to my heart, and that I think that at least part of me was kept here in 2008, and it's a little bit traumatic to be back here, but very special as well. So connection to Hong Kong, I had mentioned some Wong Kar-wai film because I thought that I had fallen in love with Hong Kong just by looking at film and looking at the city and the relations here even before I came. But the whole point is that many things happen after the trip, and many things happen. I think I met Cosme in a couple of months just immediately after that trip to China. But the point of this is that I'm going to focus the presentation not on Hong Kong nor that part, but actually on what that trip sort of made, which was it made me really a traveler. And I've spent the last 5 years specifically traveling in Latin America. The focus of the foundation that I work is in that region. It doesn't bring me necessarily to Asia, although I've been back only a couple of times. And the foundation was founded by this woman, Patricia Phelps de Cisneros, who is from Venezuela. She's from Caracas. And at their invitation, I was invited to join a team that has had a very long history. The foundation, or specifically her, Patti Cisneros, began collecting because she liked art with her husband since the 1970s. But by the late 80s, she had significantly amassed a great, very large collection. And she decided to, quote unquote, professionalize her collection, to actually create a team where there would be a better registry of the work, but also a team that could actually do research and be specialized and focus the collection in specific ways, the mission always being Latin America. At that time, the foundation offices were headquartered in Caracas. Right now, the main office is in New York City, and we do have an office that's quite active in programs in Caracas, and I'll speak later of that. But the team pretty much formed a collection that is organized in 5 different parts. The first part, or 5 research areas, not to call them departments, since we are not an institution that houses a collection publicly as a museum. But the first part is a collection of colonial art, and we could see here one of many works that are part of that collection, and a collection that is very distinctive of the colonial period, which is called casta paintings, which are paintings that were done to depict the mixing of races in the region, in colonial countries. The second collection, or the second research area, is our modern art collection. And is perhaps the most visible, the most widely known, the most widely published collection that we have. It is a collection that has specialized in geometric abstraction, and that has pretty much the largest holdings concentrated in one collection of artists like Lygia Clark, Elio Itisico, Gego, and so many more that have become staples for many artists as influential figures for their work. Strangely, and I would say that this brings me to the contemporary art collection, which is our third research area, and which is the one that I'm in charge of for developing and for interpreting since the last 5 years and a half. Our contemporary art collection does not involve or actually makes a distinction from the modern art collection. So whereas an artist like Lygia Clark or Elio Itisica, Sildo Mireles, and many other artists from Latin America that have been considered or are considered by curious museums as contemporary artists, for us, they actually are historically and theoretically, not only in terms of acquisitions, are part of another research area. When I say it focuses on geometric abstraction, the modern art collection, it is because it is an investigation not only on the reception of, say, the Western avant-garde, but also kind of analysis of the syncretism and the ways in which it was cannibalized or rethought locally within the region. So that collection is wide and spans pretty much up until the experiments that could be done of the 1970s. The contemporary art collection is tricky, and by that I mean many artists that do not fall within the actual area of investigation of, say, geometric abstraction or forms of thinking optically or phenomenologically, are in neither camp, neither the modern art nor the contemporary. So the contemporary has been able to embrace many of these artists that don't fit what have been known today as canons within art history. The contemporary art collection has nearly 2,000 works, if we count that in. And meaning if we count all these other loose threads of so-called post-war art, meaning after 1945, although we actually don't even use that year, meaning, 1945 for most of these countries is not such a relevant year as it is for the understanding of history and the concepts of memory and reorganization of the world. Many artists are prior to 1945 that would be considered here, but also many of them, and these have been part of recent acquisitions, are artists that developed a specific type of practice that, to my mind, connects many of the ideas that were explored by artists like Oiticica and contemporary artists today, someone like Amalia Pica, but many more, that has to do with performance, meaning not only the act of participation, or the viewers or the artwork's incitation for the eye or for the body to move in a different way for the work to be activated. So it is through performance that, with specific works that range from the 1960s to the present, that we've been able to connect more conceptually as well as formally some of the works in both of those collections. But then there's two more collections. One of them is an ethnographic collection that we tend to call Orinoco, which is a river in the Amazons. Most of us associate not most of us in Latin America, but outside the region, most of people associate the Amazons particularly with Brazil, although the Amazons is a very, very large area that covers different areas, and one of them is a large chunk of the state of Venezuela. I don't know if you saw the map. Maybe I should have pointed out where Venezuela was, but Venezuela is basically west of Brazil. It's in the north. I'm not going to go back to that slide, but if you don't understand the geography, it's west of Brazil, and the north part of Venezuela is in the Caribbean. The south part is obviously down, and it shares borders also with other countries like Colombia. The Orinoco collection has thousands and thousands of objects. Here I have chosen a very specific bench of the figure of the jaguar, and that will have to do with later on, or at least with a type of analysis that I would like to try to perform, although it doesn't work very well, which is the proposal of Viveiros de Castro around perspectivism. The other collection, which is not ethnographic, but it's a collection that is topic-based or genre-based, we call it within the collection the traveler artists. This is a very particular kind of collection, and it's the best of its kind. It's first made public, it was made public for the first time in the fall of 2015 with 2 exhibitions in New York and a collaboration that was developed with Hunter College. Traveler artists are basically those artists that were part of the scientific expeditions that are primarily expeditions that come from Europe, as it is in many countries here, but from Europe and North America down into the Americas. The scientific expeditions generally brought with them an artist or an illustrator. This is before the invention of the camera. The earliest work we have, which is of the 17th century, is of a Dutch artist, of Frans Post. And the most recent works within the Traveler Artist Collection are from the early 20th century, and they actually are already created by expeditions done by the artists living within their own nations. One of the most known would be Velázquez in Mexico. These are artists that were trained in so-called art academies that were set up by the Spanish colonies and that introduced European practices and skill sets and genres, pretty much like landscape. We could go on, and I could talk to you pretty much of the contents of that collection, which is very special. Today, what I'm actually going to focus on, at least for just a bit of the presentation, is to tell you how, in particular, this collection has informed some of the recent acquisitions, and how, to a large extent, particularly because of the exploratory nature of not exactly landscape as a genre, but the artist's own movement geographically, how in a way it relates, my thinking, but it also differs significantly from the kind of global circuit that is created pretty much with the art fairs, which is the subject of this date today. Ferdinand Bellerman, this is another example of that collection, and I'm being very specific into showing this also because it's Venezuela. And the other one I should actually point out why I'm presenting it as well. It's actually because it's one of the genre that actually not only includes landscape. That's the other thing, is that most traveler artists actually pictured or used the genre of landscape, meaning these are the first images of the new world that were actually being produced and sent back to Europe and to the academics and to the scientists. I should also say, and I could say that actually later, how important a traveler, the figure of the traveler, travel books actually became in popular culture, if you can believe that. Bellerman is an artist that traveled with Humboldt, who's actually a very important figure, and who many artists who have approached their practice very aware of post-colonial theory and methodologies have actually been either following or critiquing this type of work, particularly the one or the sciences that Humboldt had done. But when you focus on travel or on travel expeditions, and specifically on travel just as a very analysis of mobility, you will notice also that most of the expeditions, I mean pretty much all of them, were men. For me to think about how a collection of traveler artists historically could inform a practice today, or in what ways it differs, is to specifically look at the ways in which artists move today, not only to do a residency program or to attend an exhibition or a group show or a biennale, but actually the mobility that is possible and that occurs, that has been possible in the 20th century. Some of the artists don't really mind that. They just, myself as well, I mean, we're aware, but that's not a topic of the work, although it is a privilege that's very much enjoyed. One of them, one of the artists from Argentina who lives in Europe, but who has been very interested in expeditions and explorations, is Irene Koppelman. I would even say that this work, which is a very large painting and that accompanies also a series of drawings, is one of the most didactic approaches that I've used to actually acquire work in the collection that is both a contemporary practice, but that could be in dialogue with another one. Irene Koppelman's painting here comes from actually an expedition that she retraced from an English explorer going to the Antarctica, and a trip that she did in 2010. One of the most sort of popular and like hot book sales in the 19th century was Lloyd Stevens and Frederick Catherwood's trip to the Yucatan. They actually made two very important trips, and many artists all over the world have actually gone back to their work and to their main reference. In the case of the collection, one of the approaches that I decided to take was actually, again, within that same line of didacticism, but aware of it, was to look at an artist, a conceptual artist like Leandro Katz, also from Argentina, but based in New York City for a long time, part of the community of Oiticica there, part of the Absurdist Theater, and for a long time, until he retired most recently, professor at SVA, at the School of Visual Arts, at the invitation of Joseph Kosuth, where he was appointed to teach a class of Art of the Americas. At that time, which was in the 1980s, although he had actually begun teaching much earlier, we didn't use JPEGs nor PowerPoints, as you know, we used slides and slide projectors, and not everything of the Americas, meaning not everything that falls within the Western art history, was actually documented. So he is someone that actually began taking photographs in each of his trips of the materials that he wanted to teach in his own class. And at the same time began asking friends that in every of their trips and every of their travels to take photographs of specific sites of specific artworks so that he could incorporate within his own classes as slide materials, as a slide archive of sorts. After many years, and after noticing that this was actually something methodical, that this was systematic, that this was something that he was actually doing with much care and attention and selecting, he actually took the book of Lloyd Stevens and Catherwood and made, for several years, the expedition himself, retracing every of the sites, the archaeological sites of the then considered Mesoamerica that Lloyd Stevens and Catherwood had traveled and for the first time depicted. This book, when I say it was very popular, it was extremely popular, meaning it's still, you could find it in a bookstore as a paperback. These were the first illustrations of the ruins and you could see the front here, of the ruins of Mesoamerica, and much archaeological work sort of incited from there. Holy moly, time passes very quickly. Okay. So this very generally, just to tell you, is that this acquisition of a work like Leandro Katz also accompanies the acquisition of Catherwood's illustrations as well, which are here depicted in slides, meaning we bought both the contemporary artist and the historical material to complement that same collection of the traveler artists. This is a type of sort of dialogue that exists with the other collections. As I said, I'm focusing only with one out of the other of the contemporary art. That was sort of a joke, but I'm going to skip it. Most of the acquisitions entail actually travel to the artist studios. These are not artworks that were necessarily sold during that time. Many of the artists didn't have gallery representation then, I mean, as it is now. Many of the artists still don't have gallery representation now. But a lot of the travels also involve actually just going directly to libraries and archives to be able to find the source materials and not only the artist's work, but the references that they use. One such case is the case of Lothar Baumgarten, of which artwork from 68 to 71, first exhibited in Documenta in 1972, was actually what I would call a kind of alphabet of the entire image sort of archive and language of the entire body of work that he would develop up until this time. In this case, particularly in the case of Lothar Baumgarten, a German artist, the acquisition was actually one that could be in dialogue both with the traveler artists, a work that actually had to do with traveling and with ethnography, but also, quite curiously, with our Orinoco collection, which is where, after creating this work, the artist went to live for almost 2 years in Venezuela with the indigenous communities there. Travel, and not associated to art fairs, but to go to artist studios and to seek for work, has also what's taken me to many different, many awkward places. This here is the island of Ometepe in Nicaragua, which is the nearest and most known island would be Solantiname. And this is an artist Ernesto Salmerón, who he dropped out, literally, meaning he left the city of Managua, the capital city of the town of Nicaragua, of the country, and moved to Ometepe to be able to follow closely the process of the developments, urban sort of new kind of developments that are being developed with the discussions around the possible construction of an interoceanic canal. This is next to Panama, and this would actually break the lake in half. In order to be able to be close to the communities that are being displayed, he moved with one of them, and he continues practicing his work as a kind of social practice we could concern it. And this relates basically to also the ways in which artists who do not have or who are not part of an ecosystem of the arts participate or could participate in the sales. When I asked Ernesto, I took snapshots, which was the first photograph, and I said, can you please tell me how, if we would be interested in acquiring these paintings that I saw in your home studio, could you please send me the technical information, a PDF of your portfolio, which he never did, technical information and the price, and this would be this is actually what he sent. In that same form of resistance that he actually moved to Ometepe, he actually presents his work to be pretty much unsellable. The work is not the canvas, which I had pointed out of being interested, but now when he sends the details, he actually says everything that appears in the photograph is part of the work, meaning it is impossible to actually extract the section, or you could do it as a kind of diaporama, which is certainly not exactly an interest of ethnography. An artist also politically inclined, like Magdalena Gittrick in Argentina, to participate in a fair would send a painting like this, when the actual creation is a work like this. Or that's what the gallery would send me, and this is what I would see 2 weeks before in her studio in Buenos Aires. I'm much more interested in actually doing the trips to do that, to visit artists in their studios and to be able to see how they handle the work, how they create the work, how they eventually transform it in its public presentation. And I'm also actually very interested in looking at artists who involve an entire process in creating a single drawing, like in the case of Eduardo Navarro, who, to make a series of drawings, which are actually provoked or made by the volcano, and I will tell you where. Here, this rack. That rack is paper that would read the acids of the volcano, and that rack is actually put inside the backpack that he would wear to enter a volcano in Ecuador. And to acquire that work would mean not just to acquire the drawings made by the volcano, but to acquire actually a whole body of work that could either document the process, that could go into an online archive, and then that could accompany any form of installation. I've only spoken, as I said, of one type of dialogue. My consideration is that the contemporary arts collection could actually be set in dialogue within its own, meaning distinct from the traveler artists or even from the Orinoco. And I've considered at least a way in which they could be read in 6 different ways, pretty much using the structure of the museum or of the university to be able to understand how artists, precisely as intellectuals, have decided to not present a work or practice just based on pure sheer expression, but how they distinguish themselves as intellectuals within their communities by thinking through everything from mass media, as in the case of Ana Maria Millán, who works with footage and with filmmakers of what is called Caliwood from Cali, Colombia, or studies around urbanism, not exactly just modernism, as it is with the case of an artist like Ioso Aramburu in number 5, as it is the case with archaeologies, whether fictional or real, as it is the case in number 3 with Tania Perez Cordova, a SIM card sort of moved within a porcelain tablet, a work like number 4 of Jose Bedia, who can deal with aspects around mobility, but also African culture and migration and other belief systems, and that could also sort of allow us to read a whole body of work produced by artists today that in a way tap issues around ethnography. As I said, questions around the traveler artists, I've not necessarily thought about it necessarily as landscape or as expeditions, but certainly could organize it within studies around geology, of which there's plenty because of the material investigations, but also around geography, which could lead to other explorations, more political, I would say. The collection is largely formed also by artists, conceptual artists and more painterly artists from Venezuela, that most of the holdings are from there. And at the moment, and you could check the website, there is a current debate started by Patricia Cisneros, the founder, with the first of 3 published answers and 3 more to come of why to build or why not to build a museum to house a collection. We have not built. Returning to art fairs and relating back to the structure of museums, whether in how their systems or how the categories, even though it's a 19th century model, ultimately a modern one, the ones that we've adapted today, how we can think even of using that without the structure, without the holdings of a collection or without the structure physically of an architecture. I want to come back to one of the art fairs that I think was actually quite innovative, which is Artissima, and particularly the edition 18. Artissima, the edition 17, 18 were directed artistically by Francesco Manacorda, whose work you may know curatorially through his work at the Barbican and now as artistic director of Tate Liverpool. But originally from Turin, he actually spent between those two positions a couple of years in his hometown directing the art fair. And number 18, I would say number 17 was actually quite important, and I highlighted here something that doesn't appear, but basically he presented what actually became a trend in art fairs, even though it doesn't have a name, which is a section in the fair that would be devoted to analyzing and to presenting the work as solo shows of artists that were active during the 1960s and 1970s. Since 2010, when he first introduced that type of section within the art fair, that model has been repeated elsewhere. In fact, I would say that it even helped accelerate a market that was impending around conceptualism. And then during the 18th edition, which was in 2011, he carried on with that section, but also introduced a whole structure within the art fair that wouldn't be organized around emerging artists or galleries geographically, but that would be organized like a museum. So you had all project-based. He worked together with artist Lava Favaretto, in fact, in designing not only that, but also kind of a architectural structure. He had, if you could read there, sections that would be from the publishing department, which was actually an infographics that was sent. It was a digital infographics that it was communicated via email, but that you could also see a kind of statistics information center. It obviously had a store of books, and it had many other sections that you could read. I didn't want to finish the presentation without mentioning that beyond art fairs, and I think that what's most moving at the same time, moving the market, has been the presence of online art fairs and online sort of stores for art. And we tend to talk about art fairs because these are places that convene and also give visibility to many artists, but we forget that there's actually a very, very strong market, if slower, and even if the prices are much lower. I would say that one of the most interesting models, or at least one of the ones that I find most people use, is Artsy. I'm not sure if it's used here in Asia, but for not a very large amount of money, galleries are able to present a group of stock of storage work, for example, for sale. I'm presenting here a case of an artist, Fernanda Laguna, who's there in Artsy with the gallery from Argentina called Nora Fish. An artist like Fernanda Laguna, who has an extremely eclectic practice, who most of her work is associated to social practice and to activism, to the punk rock scene, to literary field, and an artist that has been extremely active since the 1990s, is someone that I came to know 15 years ago through a colleague, also a classmate actually, Ines Katzenstein, who tells me, this is an artist that we should be looking at. This is an artist that has been active since the 1990s. Her work doesn't look contemporary, meaning it doesn't use the language of contemporary, but her artist-run space, Belleza y Felicidad, Beauty and Happiness, is the main central place where most experimentation happens. It is a place that has brought, with the lack of schools or with the lack of other alternative centers, it is a space that has brought artistic communities to discuss and to develop art, music, literature. She is an artist that would never have a visibility and market as she's had today in the last couple of years if it weren't for art fairs or if it weren't for these type of platforms where the work, it's not sold at a great amount of prices or very much, I would say, like prolifically. But the work is now being placed in strong collections, and you can see actually an overview of practice precisely because no one bought her work from the 90s to the present day. Here in this image plate, just so you get a sense of the diverse, we have two artworks, different dates, most recent, earlier work, but basically two artworks. We have her book of poems, which is Control No Control. She has a pseudonym called Daniela Rossetti, which is basically a novel that she wrote under that pseudonym. Her translation to the English of her poetry, and Cecilia Pavon, a poet who she co-founded Belleza y Felicidad with, was translated last year by the poet Stuart Krimko. I just put a very small image there of the work that she does. Belleza y Felicidad used to be in Buenos Aires, but then moved to a villa, or what you would call in English, how do you call them in English? like favela, pues, like a slum. This is where she moved the space, and this is where she does most of her activist work, which means not doing placards and demanding things discursively, but actually working with the community to be able to develop a culture through art making, flyers and so on. Just to close, I wanted to say that I do think that I've learned a lot about art fairs, for sure. You get to see many, many things. But I do think that most of the travel, or at least most of the work that I'm interested in looking at, doesn't really get presented there. I'm very happy that Nora Fish brings someone, as of a couple of years, like Fernanda Laguna into the marketplace, and that she could bring her to different cities. Whether her work is understood by a consumer, by an audience, by a collector, within the context, beats me, because how can you explain all this, through just a fair and through a public that will stand there only for maybe a minute at the most in front of the work. Education is certainly one of the main ways in which we are able to, at the collection, share the knowledge accrued through the travels. And I was very happy to be invited in a seminar. I organize one like this every year for the last years in Caracas. And this year, we're actually focusing on the 60s, the 90s, and the 2020. In the 60s, we're focusing on three main figures that changed institutions in Latin America. Pictured here is Miguel Arroyo, that set up pretty much the systems in place for the Museum of Fine Arts during that decade in Caracas. In the 1990s, we're actually focusing in exhibitions, and three exhibitions that happen in Latin America will be the actual focus. And for 2020, which is Perfect Vision, an artist told me about that. I was just trying to sort of do a 30-30-30 so that we could actually also coincide with the year after the elections, which is 2019 in that country, to be able to think of projects for the future, institutions for the future, projects to be developed in community and with artists. So thank you very much. I hope I was in time, and hopefully we can have a discussion right now in the plenary.